Studied Section 4, The Factor Proportion Theory. Introduction. So far, we have established the fact that differences in productivity and specificity are the basis for trade. In a world of one factor, Ricardian trade tells us that trade will occur if there are differences in labor productivity. This model therefore assumes that countries have the same factor endowment. The shortcoming of this theory is straightforward. First, in real life, more than one factor of production engages in production. Second, countries differ in their resource endowment. For instance, it would be wrong to submit that Nigeria exports oil because it has high labor productivity. In actual fact, what is responsible for massive export of crude oil in Nigeria is resource endowment, perhaps not factor productivity. Thus, Ricardian model may not likely explain the basis for trade, particularly between Nigeria and, say, the US or UK. A realistic view of trade must therefore allow for the importance of not just labor but of other factors of production such as capital and mineral resources. The present model, called factor proportion or Exshaw-Hurlin framework, will consider the role of factor endowment in trade. The model shall assume that factors of production are the same across countries, but there exist different factors of production endowment. We will then explore into how this endowment differential leads to trade. We shall also examine the gainers, losers from trade. The factor proportion model, HO of trade. The factor proportion theory was developed by two Swedish economists, Eli Exshaw and Bertil Ohlin. The theory is usually referred to Exshaw-Hurlin or simply HO framework. The factor proportion theory shows the interplay between how different factors of production are available in different countries and the proportion in which they are used in producing different goods. Like in the factor-specific model, this model assumes two factors, two countries and two goods. Also, the production of each good will require the use of the two factors. Unlike the specific factor model, no factor is specific to any sector. For simplicity, let us assume the production of two goods, computer in unit and textile in yard. Further, assuming that we have two factors of production, labor and capital. Let capital be measured per unit while labor is measured per hour. We also assume that there is no market imperfection. That is, the market is perfectly competitive, implying that there is no wage distortion, no existence of labor union or price distortion, no minimum wage law or subsidies for farmers. In particular, it is the forces of demand and supply that determine wage rate, rental rate and goods prices. Finally, it is assumed that there is always full employment of factors of production. Unlike the Ricardian model, there are no rooms for choice in the use of inputs. For example, producers of textile products in Nigeria may increase textile output by recruiting more workers, in which case textile is labor-intensive. It may also be the case that producers may hire more capital in its production process so that the good is capital-intensive. If more labor is used, then less capital must be used, and vice versa. In this case, there is a trade-off between the use of factors. The question that comes to mind is what will motivate the choice of input, that is, what will cause a firm to use more of one factor and less of the other. The relative cost of labor and capital of cars. If cost of capital is very high relative to cost of labor, a profit-maximizing firm will tend to use more labor and less capital. Conversely, if cost of capital is relatively less than cost of labor, a profit-maximizing firm will hire more capital and less labor. Thus, the choice of input rests importantly on the factor-price ratio. Now, let us assume that the factor proportion in Nigeria is depicted as shown in Table 4.1 below. That is, Nigeria will use 2 labor and 10 capital to produce 1 unit of computer, while it will use 20 labor and 5 capital for producing 1 yard of textile. Thus, the capital labor ratio K over L in computer and textile will be 10 over 2 is equal to 5 and 5 over 20 is equal to 0.25 respectively. Table 4.1 Example of factor proportion in Nigeria. What this implies is that in Nigeria, where C and T are computer and textile respectively, now let W represent wage while R represent cost of capital, so that factor price ratio will be given by W over R. What equation 4.1 says is that at any W over R, production of textile will always use higher ratio of labor to capital than production of computer. In this case, textile is labor intensive. It is easy to show the relationship of factor price ratio and capital labor ratio for each product. This is shown in figure 4.1 below, as can be verified from the graph at the quantity of capital required in textile industry is Q raised to power T, which is less than capital required in computer industry Q raised to power C, where W over R moved to W over R in bracket squared capital chosen is at E, while in computer it is E prime. Note that factor intensity demonstrated in this graph implies the proportion of factor used in output, not the proportion of factor used to output. Thus, a good cannot be both land and labor intensive. Figure 4.1 Factor prices and input choices. Factor prices and good prices. With the assumption of perfectly competitive market, if the economy produces the two goods, forces of demand and supply of goods will determine a unit price of each good, and this will be equal to unit cost of each factor input. That is, if for instance the cost of producing computer is high, we expect the price of computer to rise. That is, cost of production depends on its price. But what accounts for a high or low cost of production? If a sector, say computer, uses more capital, if the price of hiring a unit of capital rises, there is tendency for total cost of producing computer to rise. Whereas, if the price of labor rises, total cost may not rise, since labor are needed in small quantity in computer sector. Therefore, a rise in the relative factor price will lead to a corresponding rise in output price ratio. That is, there is a positive relationship between factor price and output price. This is illustrated in the graph below. We can use figures 4.1 and 4.2 to show the relationship between goods prices and factor price ratio. To do this, place figure 4.2 beside 4.1 and let it face the left side as shown in figure 4.3 below. The graph therefore tells us that owners of capital will have higher income relative to owners of labor. That is, capital owner will be better off relative to owners of labor. Income distribution effect of trade in HO framework. What has been established so far in HO framework is that the basis for trade is factor endowment differentials. A country with relatively high endowment in a particular factor in an activity that uses such factor intensively in production should specialize in the production of that good and export it. However, we have not examined the effect of such arrangement on factor income. Note that trade leads to relative price convergence, and this has strong implications for labor and capital. For example, after trade, price of textile will rise in Nigeria and hence wages. This will lead to increase in the purchasing power of workers in terms of both goods. Conversely, trade will cause the price of computer to fall in Nigeria and hence worsens the purchasing power of capital owner. In the US, the opposite will be the case, that is, the purchasing power of US capital owner will take two. Of US capital owner will rise in terms of both goods while it worsens the purchasing power of labor. Thus, if the basis for trade is factor endowment differential, then owners of labor will gain in the labor abundant economy while owners of capital will lose. Owners of capital will gain in the capital abundant country while owners of labor will lose. Simply put, in a HO world of trade, owners of abundant factor gains, but owners of a scarce factor loses. Summary: we developed a model of two goods, two factors, and two countries, with one of the goods having intensive use of one of the resources. Also, at a given wage rental ratio, production of one the goods will use higher capital to labor than production of others. An increase in the supply of one factor expands production possibilities in a strongly biased way in favor of factor used intensively. Thus, a country having abundant resource relative to others will produce and export a good for which that resource is intensive in production. During trade relative price converges, FPE, and as a result, income of owners of abundant factor gain, while owners of scarce factor experience low income. Overall, trade benefit both partners. This is the end of study section 4. Thanks for listening.